Your soulmate finished writing a secret love letter at 11:26 tonight, but they never intended for anyone except you to read it. The envelope remained sealed on their desk for nearly 3 hours while they kept asking themselves the same impossible question: if this letter reaches them tomorrow, will it finally tell the truth, or will it simply arrive too late? Tomorrow morning, someone is expected to collect several boxes containing journals, old photographs, handwritten notebooks, voice recordings, and every personal reminder connected to the chapter of life both of you once believed would last forever. Your soulmate has already signed the paperwork allowing those memories to be archived, sorted, and eventually stored somewhere they will no longer have daily access to them. That decision was not made because they stopped caring. It was made because carrying unfinished conversations had quietly become heavier than carrying the memories themselves. Yet while preparing everything for tomorrow's collection, something unexpected happened. Hidden between 2 pages of an old notebook was a folded sheet of paper they had completely forgotten existed. The moment they recognized their own handwriting, they stopped packing immediately. It was not another journal entry. It was not a diary page or unfinished poem. It was the first version of a love letter they had started writing shortly after everything between both of you began changing in ways neither of you fully understood. They remembered sitting alone late one evening believing that if they could simply explain what had been happening inside their heart, perhaps everything would make sense again. But every attempt ended the same way. The letter was folded away before it could ever be finished because they convinced themselves that silence would somehow protect both of you from even greater pain. Tonight, after discovering those forgotten pages again, they finally understood how wrong that decision had been. Silence had protected nothing. It had only allowed unanswered questions to become permanent memories. They slowly unfolded the fragile paper and began reading words they had not seen in months. Some sentences were crossed out. Others ended halfway across the page before suddenly stopping, as though emotion had interrupted every thought. Yet even inside those unfinished paragraphs one truth appeared over and over again. They had never stopped trying to understand what happened between both of you. Every page spoke about conversations that almost happened, questions they wanted to ask but never found the courage to speak aloud, and quiet moments where they believed one honest discussion could still change everything. Reading those forgotten words felt like meeting an earlier version of themselves, someone who still believed difficult conversations always arrived before permanent goodbyes. Your soulmate placed the unfinished letter beside the newly packed boxes and quietly realized something that immediately changed tomorrow's plans. If those memories were archived before you read this letter, someone else might eventually understand your shared story better than the person who actually lived it. That thought became impossible to accept. They reopened every storage box they had carefully sealed earlier that evening. Old notebooks returned to the desk. Photographs spread across the room. Ticket stubs, postcards, restaurant receipts, handwritten birthday cards, travel itineraries, pressed flowers, tiny souvenirs, and countless ordinary reminders slowly surrounded them until the room looked less like a home preparing for closure and more like a life asking for one final opportunity to explain itself honestly. Hours passed as they searched through every page, hoping to understand why this particular letter had remained unfinished while everything else had continued moving forward. Eventually another notebook revealed the answer. Tucked between ordinary planning pages was a short handwritten note dated only 3 days after the original letter had been abandoned. It contained a single sentence, "Not yet. They deserve the complete truth, not the version I understand today." Your soulmate stared at those words for several minutes before quietly lowering the notebook. They remembered writing them during a period when confusion seemed stronger than certainty. Back then they believed waiting would eventually reveal missing pieces of the story. Instead, waiting only created more silence, more assumptions, and more distance until both of you slowly began remembering different versions of the same events. Tonight they finally accepted something they had spent months avoiding. The complete truth never arrives simply because enough time passes. Sometimes truth remains hidden because the people carrying it never ask one more difficult question. Determined not to repeat that mistake again, your soulmate continued searching through every forgotten page until another discovery quietly stopped them. Hidden inside a sealed envelope marked, "Only if tomorrow becomes too late," rested several smaller notes written on different dates over many months. None had ever been mailed. None had ever been shown to another person. Every one of them began differently, yet all reached the same conclusion. They were trying to explain something they themselves had not fully understood while it was happening. One note admitted they had mistaken your silence for indifference. Another confessed they had allowed outside opinions to become louder than direct conversations. Another described how fear quietly convinced them that asking honest questions might somehow make everything worse. Reading those words together revealed something heartbreaking. The letter you were about to receive tomorrow was never meant to be written all at once. It had quietly been written across months of regret, reflection, missed opportunities, and slowly growing understanding. Every unfinished page belonged to a different version of the same person learning the same lesson from a different direction. As midnight quietly approached, your soulmate placed every unfinished note into a single envelope before taking out a fresh sheet of paper. For the first time since the relationship changed, they no longer wanted to explain only what happened. They wanted to explain what they had finally learned because of everything that happened. They understood that if tomorrow arrived before this letter reached you, another chapter of your shared story would quietly disappear into storage beside all the other memories already waiting inside those sealed boxes. They were no longer afraid that the truth might change your opinion of them. They were afraid that another sunrise might permanently preserve a version of the past that neither of you would choose if given one final opportunity to tell it honestly. Holding the pen once again, they carefully wrote the first sentence of what would become the most important letter they had ever written. "Before tomorrow carries these memories somewhere neither of us can quietly reach again, there is one truth you deserve to hear from me instead of discovering it years from now inside a box filled with things I should have said while we still had time." They paused after writing those words, not because they doubted them, but because another memory had suddenly returned with remarkable clarity. It was a conversation both of you shared months before everything changed, a conversation that seemed ordinary then but now explained why this letter had remained unfinished for so long. That forgotten conversation would become the first truth written on the next page, and once your soulmate remembered every detail, they realized it would change the meaning of everything that followed. Your soulmate never expected the second page of the letter to become the hardest one to write. The opening paragraphs had described the memories both of you once shared, but the next section required something much more difficult than remembering. It required admitting how easily silence had been allowed to replace honesty. As the night grew quieter, every unopened notebook, every old photograph, and every forgotten envelope spread across the room seemed to carry the same unanswered question. What would have happened if this conversation had taken place when it was supposed to? Your soulmate searched through another storage box, hoping to organize everything before tomorrow's collection arrived, when a small envelope slipped from between two journals and landed on the floor. It looked ordinary except for one detail. Across the front, in handwriting they immediately recognized as their own, someone had written, open only after you understand what really happened. They had absolutely no memory of writing those words. Slowly opening the envelope, they found several folded pages containing dates, short observations, unfinished thoughts, and reminders they had written during the weeks when both of you were slowly drifting apart without truly understanding why. None of those pages accused you of doing anything wrong. Instead, every note described moments when something felt strangely incomplete. There were references to messages that seemed shorter than expected, conversations that suddenly changed direction without explanation, plans that somehow disappeared before both of you could confirm them, and long periods when replies arrived so differently from what had been expected that your soulmate quietly convinced themselves you no longer wished to explain anything. At the time, those moments seemed too ordinary to question. Tonight they appeared connected in ways they had never imagined. Looking carefully through the dates, your soulmate noticed another detail. Almost every misunderstanding followed an interrupted conversation. Sometimes the interruption lasted only a few hours. Other times it stretched across several days. Each delay quietly allowed assumptions to grow stronger than direct communication. Reading those notes months later felt like watching two completely different stories unfolding side by side. One story existed inside memory, where both of you slowly became strangers because neither person believed the other still wanted to understand. The other story existed inside these forgotten pages, revealing that both of you had repeatedly tried to continue conversations that somehow never reached the moment they needed most. Your soulmate placed those papers beside the unfinished love letter and quietly admitted something they had never spoken aloud before. They had spent far too much time asking themselves why everything changed, when perhaps the better question had always been whether both of you were reacting to the same version of events at all. That realization remained with them as they opened another notebook filled with ordinary daily plans. Grocery lists, appointment reminders, travel ideas, and future goals covered most of the pages until one folded sheet appeared between two calendar entries. Unlike the others, this page had never been crossed out. It contained a list titled simply, "Questions I Still Want to Ask." The questions were heartbreakingly simple. Did something happen that you haven't been able to explain? Are we protecting each other by staying quiet, or are we slowly losing each other because we are afraid to speak? If one conversation could still change everything, would we both be brave enough to have it? Your soulmate stared at those questions until tears quietly blurred the ink. None of them had ever been asked. Not because there wasn't enough time, but because fear had quietly convinced both of you that waiting one more day might somehow make difficult conversations easier. Instead, every postponed conversation slowly became another unanswered memory. Midnight quietly passed while the room remained filled with scattered reminders of a life that had once seemed certain. Every object carried a different memory. A ticket from a concert both of you almost missed because you spent an hour talking in the parking lot afterward. A restaurant receipt with handwritten jokes scribbled across the back. A photograph taken moments before unexpected rain forced both of you to laugh while running for cover. None of those memories contained dramatic promises. They simply reminded your soulmate that your relationship had always been strongest during honest conversations, not perfect circumstances. Somewhere along the way, honesty became more frightening than silence, and silence quietly began deciding things neither of you ever intended to surrender. Determined not to repeat that mistake again, your soulmate unfolded another blank sheet of paper and began rewriting the letter from the beginning. This time they refused to focus only on regret. Instead, they carefully described every lesson hidden inside the months that followed your separation. They admitted that memories become unreliable whenever unanswered questions are allowed to remain unanswered for too long. They confessed that protecting yourself from disappointment can sometimes become another way of avoiding difficult conversations. They acknowledged that love cannot survive on assumptions, no matter how convincing those assumptions seem. Every paragraph became less about defending the past and more about understanding it honestly. Hours passed without your soulmate noticing the time. Outside, the first light of morning slowly began replacing the darkness. Tomorrow had almost arrived. The packed storage boxes still waited near the front door exactly where they had been placed earlier that evening, but now your soulmate knew they could not allow those boxes to leave before this letter was finished. They reopened the largest container one final time and removed the oldest notebook resting at the very bottom. It had been untouched for years. Inside, pressed carefully between two pages, rested a tiny folded piece of paper no larger than a bookmark. Curious, they opened it carefully and immediately recognized the date. It had been written during one of the happiest periods of your relationship, long before confusion, distance, or unanswered questions ever appeared. On it, you had written just one sentence after an ordinary conversation both of you almost forgot by the following morning: "Promise me that if life ever becomes complicated, we will always choose one more honest conversation before believing the worst about each other." Your soulmate covered their eyes as those words quietly echoed through the silent room. That promise had never truly disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath months of uncertainty neither of you ever intended to carry alone. They carefully placed that small note inside the envelope containing the completed love letter because they finally understood it belonged there more than anywhere else. It was not simply another memory. It was the reason this letter had to exist at all. Before sealing the envelope, your soulmate added one final handwritten sentence beneath everything else they had written that night. Tomorrow may carry these memories away, but before it does, there is one conversation I refuse to leave unfinished any longer. As they reached for the envelope, another forgotten document slipped from the back cover of the notebook and quietly landed beside the letter. Unlike every discovery before it, this page had not been written by either of you. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone whose name had not been spoken in months, and the first paragraph immediately explained why so many important conversations had quietly fallen apart without either of you fully understanding what had been happening. The letter should have ended with the memories your soulmate had already gathered, yet while placing every page back inside the envelope, they noticed something unusual about the oldest notebook lying open across the desk. The inside cover had begun separating from the binding after years of being stored inside the same wooden box. As they carefully pressed it back into place, a thin folded document slipped from a hidden compartment neither of you had ever noticed before. It was sealed inside a transparent sleeve to protect it from age, and unlike the rest of the papers scattered throughout the room, this one carried no date across the top. Instead, someone had written only a single sentence in the upper corner: "Keep this until the truth becomes more important than protecting everyone's feelings." Your soulmate immediately recognized the handwriting. It belonged to someone who had quietly witnessed many important moments of your relationship but had always remained in the background, choosing observation instead of involvement. That person had never taken sides, never encouraged conflict, and never offered opinions unless directly asked. The discovery immediately raised another question. Why would they hide something inside a notebook that had remained untouched for so long? Slowly unfolding the pages, your soulmate expected another forgotten memory. Instead, They found a carefully organized timeline describing several conversations that had taken place during the weeks before everything changed between both of you. Every conversation had one thing in common. They all involved people trying to explain what they believed was happening without ever speaking directly to the two people most affected by those assumptions. One page described concerns shared privately instead of openly. Another documented advice given based on incomplete information. Another simply noted how quickly uncertainty had turned into confidence once enough people repeated the same explanation. Your soulmate quietly realized that the greatest distance between both of you had not been created during one argument. It had grown little by little each time another conversation happened somewhere else instead of between the two of you. The pages continued with observations that became increasingly difficult to read. They described moments when both of you attempted to restart honest communication, only for timing, fear, exhaustion, or outside pressure to interrupt before those conversations reached the truth. Looking back, your soulmate remembered each one of those moments differently. At the time they believed every interruption proved you were slowly giving up. Reading these notes now suggested something entirely different. Both of you had continued reaching toward each other while quietly believing the other person had already stopped trying. The misunderstanding became strongest not because either of you lacked love, but because neither person fully understood what the other was carrying in silence. As midnight quietly gave way to the first signs of morning, your soulmate placed the document beside the unfinished letter and searched through another storage box hoping to understand why it had remained hidden. Beneath several old journals rested a small envelope containing photographs neither of you had looked at in years. Most showed ordinary moments that had once seemed too simple to preserve: afternoons spent walking without a destination, coffee cups covered in handwritten notes, books exchanged with short messages inside the covers, celebrations that were never posted publicly because they mattered more privately than publicly. Tucked between those photographs rested another folded page. This one contained something your soulmate had completely forgotten. It was a list both of you had written together after one late-night conversation about trust. Rather than making promises about forever, both of you had agreed on several simple commitments. The first promised never to let pride replace honest questions. The second promised to speak directly before believing someone else's explanation. The third promised that if either of you ever felt misunderstood, one uninterrupted conversation would always come before any permanent decision. Your soulmate slowly lowered the paper and closed their eyes. Every promise written there had been created because both of you believed communication would always remain stronger than fear. Somewhere along the journey, fear quietly became louder. Not because either of you chose it deliberately, but because difficult conversations kept arriving at moments when exhaustion, uncertainty, and outside voices made waiting seem easier than honesty. Yet waiting never solved anything. It simply allowed incomplete stories to grow stronger with every passing week. Looking around the room, your soulmate realized something they had never admitted before. They had spent months searching for the exact moment everything ended, believing one mistake explained everything that followed. These recovered pages revealed another truth. Relationships rarely collapse because of one unforgettable event. They slowly become surrounded by unanswered questions until memories themselves begin changing shape. The people inside those memories remain the same, yet the meaning attached to them quietly shifts each time another conversation never happens. Dawn slowly approached while the finished love letter remained open on the desk beside every recovered document. Your soulmate carefully read each page from beginning to end, making small changes wherever regret sounded stronger than responsibility. They refused to describe themselves as another victim of misunderstanding because they knew they still carried responsibility for every moment when courage gave way to silence. They admitted that discovering hidden pages could explain the past without excusing every decision made afterward. Before placing the final sheet inside the envelope, they added one last paragraph they had not planned to write. It read, "If tomorrow becomes the day these memories leave my hands forever, I refuse to let them leave carrying a version of us that was never given the chance to tell its complete story." They reached for the envelope, believing the letter was finally complete. Then their phone quietly vibrated across the desk. A new notification appeared from an address they did not recognize. Attached was a scanned copy of a meeting record dated only 2 days before your final conversation. Beneath the attachment appeared one brief sentence that immediately changed everything once again: "You deserve to know who decided that some truths should never reach either of you." The unfamiliar email remained unopened for several minutes because your soulmate had already uncovered more truth in one night than they believed possible. Every page of the love letter had been rewritten again and again, yet this unexpected message suggested there was still one chapter neither of you had ever seen. Eventually they opened the attachment, expecting another forgotten memory or misplaced document. Instead, they found the minutes from a private meeting held only 48 hours before the day both of you finally stopped speaking. Your soulmate recognized several names immediately. These were people who had quietly influenced important decisions during that season of life, yet neither you nor your soulmate had ever been present during this particular conversation. The document did not accuse anyone of intentionally destroying the relationship. It revealed something far more ordinary, and therefore far more painful. Several people admitted they believed both of you were becoming overwhelmed by responsibilities, constant pressure, and repeated misunderstandings. Rather than encouraging an honest conversation between the two of you, they chose what seemed easier at the time. They decided difficult discussions could wait until emotions settled. Small concerns were left unexplained because everyone assumed another opportunity would naturally appear. That opportunity never came. Reading each page slowly, your soulmate realized how many important truths had remained unfinished simply because everyone believed there would always be another tomorrow. There were notes describing conversations postponed because someone was traveling. Other discussions were delayed because work became unexpectedly demanding. One meeting ended early because nobody wanted to create additional stress before an important commitment. None of those decisions seemed harmful individually, yet together they quietly built months of silence that neither of you fully understood. Your soulmate gently placed the printed pages beside the unfinished love letter and looked around the room filled with memories waiting to be packed away forever. Every photograph suddenly carried a different meaning. Every handwritten note now seemed to ask the same question. How many relationships are changed not by one terrible decision, but by dozens of ordinary conversations that never happen when they are needed most? The answer quietly unfolded inside the next attachment. It contained a timeline prepared by someone who had spent months organizing old correspondence after discovering inconsistencies between dates, archived files, and personal journals. The timeline revealed that several important conversations both of you believed happened weeks apart had actually taken place within only a few days of one another. Memory had quietly rearranged everything. Pain had stretched certain moments while almost completely erasing others. Looking at the corrected sequence of events, your soulmate noticed something they had never realized before. Every time one misunderstanding appeared, both of you attempted to repair it almost immediately. Neither of you truly stopped trying. Instead, each new attempt arrived while the previous misunderstanding remained unresolved, creating layer after layer of confusion until neither person could remember where the original problem had even begun. Your soulmate leaned back in complete silence. They had spent months believing distance grew because feelings slowly disappeared. The document suggested something entirely different. Feelings had remained remarkably consistent. What disappeared was confidence that another honest conversation would still change anything. That quiet loss of hope had become more damaging than any single disagreement. As dawn slowly approached, your soulmate carefully organized every recovered document into one final folder labeled simply, "The Complete Story." They no longer wanted separate versions of the past scattered across forgotten notebooks and hidden envelopes. If tomorrow truly became the day those memory boxes left the house forever, they wanted one place where every important truth remained together. They returned to the love letter and read every page from beginning to end one final time. Some sentences still carried traces of regret, but none attempted to escape responsibility. They openly admitted that discovering forgotten evidence did not erase the pain created while both of you believed incomplete stories. They acknowledged that healing could never be demanded simply because new information had finally appeared. Most importantly, they accepted that trust is rebuilt not by dramatic revelations but by consistent honesty after the revelations end. Before sealing the envelope, they wrote one final paragraph they had not planned to include. "Tomorrow these boxes may leave my home, but I refuse to let them carry away the truth before you have the opportunity to hear it from me. If this letter becomes the last thing we ever share, let it be remembered as the moment silence finally stopped writing our story." They folded every page carefully, placed the completed letter inside the envelope, and reached toward the stack of storage boxes waiting beside the front door. Just before closing the largest box for the final time, something small slipped from the inside cover of an old journal and landed quietly on the wooden floor. It was a sealed envelope neither of you had ever seen before. Across the front, written in handwriting that belonged to neither of you, appeared only 7 words that immediately stopped your soulmate from moving another step: "Open this only after the letter is finished." At that moment, they realized the secret love letter had explained what both of you had lost, but the final envelope was about to reveal why someone had believed the truth should remain hidden until tomorrow. Morning arrived far more quietly than your soulmate had expected. The sealed envelope rested on the table beside the final storage boxes, but after everything discovered during the previous night, those boxes no longer felt like the ending of a story. Instead, they had become a reminder of how many important moments had almost been forgotten simply because nobody believed they needed one more honest conversation. Your soulmate looked once more at the envelope with your name written carefully across the front. Every page inside had been rewritten so many times that the original draft was almost impossible to recognize. The first version had been filled with confusion. The second had been shaped by regret. The final version carried something completely different. It carried responsibility. Before the movers arrived to collect the journals, photographs, notebooks, and keepsakes that had filled the room for years, your soulmate made one final decision. The love letter would leave their hands before anything else did. Whatever happened afterward, they refused to let another chapter of your shared story disappear into sealed boxes before you had the chance to hear the truth directly from them. Carefully placing the envelope inside a protective folder, they stepped outside into the cool morning air. Every familiar street looked unchanged, yet everything inside them felt different. They were no longer rehearsing explanations or searching for perfect words. They had finally accepted that honesty does not become more valuable because it is perfectly spoken. It becomes valuable because it finally arrives. During the walk, memories quietly returned. Not the painful ones that had occupied every thought for months, but the ordinary moments that had first taught them why your connection mattered. They remembered conversations that lasted long after the destination had been forgotten, laughter that appeared during difficult days without either of you trying to force it, quiet evenings when simply sitting together felt more meaningful than any carefully planned celebration. Those memories reminded your soulmate that relationships are rarely built through extraordinary events. They are built through ordinary moments repeated with patience, trust, kindness, and the willingness to keep showing up even when life becomes complicated. Somewhere along the way, both of you had continued caring while slowly losing confidence that the other person still understood. Looking back now, your soulmate realized that love had not disappeared first. Understanding had. That realization changed the purpose of the letter completely. It was no longer written to recover the past. It was written to make sure the future would never again depend on unanswered questions. When they finally reached the place where the letter would be delivered, they paused for several minutes without moving. For months they had imagined this moment ending with a dramatic speech or an emotional confession. Instead, silence surrounded everything. They gently placed the envelope where it would safely reach you and turned away without expecting an immediate reply. They understood that some truths deserve time to be read without pressure. Hours later, after returning home, the storage company arrived exactly as scheduled. One by one, the familiar boxes were carried toward the waiting vehicle. Every journal, photograph, ticket stub, postcard, and notebook that had once seemed impossible to let go quietly disappeared through the front door. Surprisingly, your soulmate felt no panic watching them leave. They finally understood something the previous night had been trying to teach them. Memories do not disappear simply because objects are packed away. The lessons learned from them remain. As the final box was lifted into the truck, your soulmate noticed one small notebook still resting alone on the desk. It had been overlooked because it contained nothing except blank pages, except for the very last page. Curious, they opened it and found only one handwritten sentence they had completely forgotten writing years earlier: "If we ever lose our way, promise me we will always leave one door open for the truth." Reading those words brought a quiet smile instead of sadness. They realized that, regardless of what happened next, that promise had finally been honored. The truth had been spoken without conditions, without demands, and without expecting a particular ending. Late that evening, as the now nearly empty room settled into silence, a single notification appeared on their phone. It was not a long message. It contained no dramatic declarations, no promises, and no immediate answers. It simply confirmed that the envelope had reached its destination. Your soulmate placed the phone back on the table without opening another conversation. They knew the next chapter, whatever it became, deserved to unfold naturally rather than through urgency. Looking around the quiet room, they finally accepted the lesson that had been hidden inside every unfinished page of the letter. The greatest mistake had never been loving too deeply. It had been believing that difficult conversations could always wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow eventually arrives, but opportunities sometimes do not. Before switching off the light, your soulmate whispered a quiet promise meant for themselves as much as for you. No important truth would ever again remain trapped inside an unopened envelope. Whether this letter became the beginning of a new conversation or the final page of a chapter that had shaped both of your lives, it had already accomplished the one purpose that mattered most. It replaced silence with honesty. And sometimes, even when the future remains uncertain, that is where every meaningful ending, and every meaningful beginning, truly starts.